My guest at this time is Frank Gaffney. He's president of the Center for Security Policy and also served as an assistant secretary of defense in the Reagan administration. Earlier this week, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley announced she would step down from that position at the end of the year. President Trump says he wants to have her replacement nominated in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So, what is Nikki Haley's legacy at the UN, and what type of person should Trump be looking for to replace her? And Frank, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. Thank you, Greg.
Well, let's start with Nikki Haley before we get to who ought to replace her. Here's what she said in the Oval Office earlier this week about what she sees as the legacy of the past 2 years.
Look at what has happened in 2 years with the United States on foreign policy. Now, the United States is respected. Countries may not like what we do, but they respect what we do. They know that if we say we're going to do something, we follow it through, and the president proved that, whether it was with the chemical weapons in Syria, whether it's with NATO, saying that other countries have to pay their share. I mean, whether it's the trade deals, which have been amazing, they get that the president means business, and they follow through with that.
Frank, what do you see as Nikki Haley's legacy?
I think she has been the face in that very public forum of the president's Make America Great strategy. She has been a very effective spokesperson for it. She has been a tireless defender of America against all attacks. She has been a catalyst for really tough love for the United Nations and its various corrupt and malfeasant entities. And I think, in short, she's very much in the mold of some of the truly great UN ambassadors from the United States. Jeane Kirkpatrick, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, John Bolton come to mind. And I would hope very much that the president will replace her with someone of a similar both capability as well as clarity in terms of their admiration and love, indeed, for our country and, vigor in being willing to defend her.
How significant is this position when it comes to U.S. foreign policy? Obviously, it matters a lot because they're the face of the United States at the United Nations, and what they have to say gets a lot of attention. But ultimately, it's the president and certainly the Secretary of State who generally have the most influence on policy. So how significant is the role?
It varies greatly from administration to administration and even from, the ambassador within administrations. It's a function very much of both the temperament and quality of the individual who's in the job, as well as the kind of relationship they have to the president and, for that matter, to others in the senior reaches of the administration. In this case, I think there's no question that as a cabinet member, some are, some aren't, but in her case, Ambassador Haley was a cabinet member as well as a UN representative. She did have influence. I think if in no other way, what she went out and said did have an impact on policy, as well as, simply broadcasting the policies that were being crafted in Washington. I think she was, in some cases, stretching the envelope, as they say, and that did have an effect of both reinforcing the broad outlines of the president's policy and I think to some extent shaping it as well.
Frank, one of the names floated shortly after the Haley announcement to succeed her was former Deputy National Security Advisor Dina Powell. On Thursday, she took her name out of the running, but your comment that you gave at the time that her name was being mentioned, and you were critical of the idea of her replacing Nikki Haley, was not just about Powell. You've suggested that there's a right mindset to have at the UN and a wrong one. Explain what you mean by that and what the president should be looking for here.
Well, partly, Greg, of course, it's a question of the policy of the government. There's right and wrong policies. We saw, for example, during the Obama years, there was this certain citizen of the world mindset, and the United States was relegated to more or less just another nation, which is, of course, part of the artifice of the UN, the General Assembly most especially. You can have the tiniest of countries having an equal vote to the United States in the General Assembly. In the Security Council, of course, we have a larger role, a veto-wielding role, but we're on a par with France, for that matter, or Britain, and that's not, of course, entirely accurate. More to the point, I think that there is this question of if the policies of the administration are sound, and I think by and large that's true of the Trump administration, you don't want somebody as an ambassador representing our government, representing this administration, representing this president, who is at odds with the policies of the president. And that was certainly true of Dina Powell during the time she served under H.R. McMaster, the then National Security Advisor. I call them the insubordinate subordinates. And, you just don't want either the friction in the policymaking process, to the extent that the UN representative does play a role in it, and more to the point, the confusion that it creates among our international interlocutors in the United Nations itself and elsewhere around the world. And for that matter, you don't want us to be in a situation where the individual who is interfacing with them is actually expressing more sympathy for those others' positions than those of our own government. That can be extremely counterproductive. So I'm glad that Dina Powell has taken her name out of contention. That was really going to be a nightmare, I think. But I hope the president will be, in fact, looking for someone very much in the Nikki Haley mold. And if he does, I think he'll be well served.
Any in particular you'd like to volunteer to him to consider?
Well, there are some names that are kicking around, and some are probably not runners, but there are some people who certainly fit the profile that I think is needed here. One is the former Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, who, interestingly enough, has until recently been working for a non-governmental organization as sort of a representative to the United Nations. She's very familiar with what goes on there, and she is, needless to say, a forceful advocate for America in much the same mold as the president and Nikki Haley, John Bolton, and the like. There's some talk about Lindsey Graham, who of late in particular has been quite robust, being a possible exponent for the United States there. Another friend of mine who I think would be terrific has been a dogged critic of the UN for a long time as a journalist. Her name is Claudia Rosette. She's long been with the Wall Street Journal and other publications, and few people know where the bodies are buried, literally, in the United Nations policy process like Claudia does. She may remember was the one who uncovered the Saddam Hussein oil for food program and the scandals associated with that. So I think she'd be great, but I don't know if she's even willing to serve, let alone a real candidate. But she's the kind of person, again, that I think we need.
Well, as the president said, we'll probably know sometime this month. Frank, always great to have your insights. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Frank Gaffney is president of the Center for Security Policy, served as an assistant secretary of defense in the Reagan administration. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.